Hello, everyone. My name is Victor Cheng with CaseInterview.com. Today, I have the privilege and honor of interviewing professional matchmaker Cassindy Chao. Cassindy is a matchmaker at Keller International, as well as her own firm, AWM Love. She's got over 20 years of matchmaking experience. She started off her career as an investment banker, of all things, at Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, the creme de la creme of that industry. She has roamed the halls of Silicon Valley as a startup CEO and certainly understands that industry as well. And today, she's a professional matchmaker. Her clients, will remain confidential, include a Nobel laureate, CEO of a Fortune 500 company, CEO of a private equity company, professors at East Coast universities, internationally known artists, and chief marketing officers of consumer product goods companies. She works with investment bankers as clients, lawyers, really sort of the elite professions that we often talk about and people sort of in our circle strive for. She's either done it herself or works with them in terms of helping them find love. And so today, first of all, Cassindy, welcome. I'm so excited to have you and looking forward to our conversation today.
Thank you, Victor. I am so honored to be part of your program.
So I really wanted to talk to you about three topics today, and we'll sort of jump around a little bit. But first, I want to cover, you have a very non-traditional, you have a very traditional career path until it went non-traditional, right? And you're Asian American. We've had this conversation before around culture and familial expectations. So I want to dive in on that first. Then I want to learn a lot about like your professional expertise today, right? Advice for people who are dating and what do you put into that relative to a high-powered career? And also for those who are already in a relationship, what are some tips for how to really nurture and have a good romantic relationship? But first, let's talk about Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, CEO of a Silicon Valley startup. Those are all sort of approved, socially approved professions. How did you get started in all this? Where did you start in your career? And how did you end up being a matchmaker?
Sure. So it actually all started off even with my Asian family, a family of scientists, already being shocked that I was going into banking. Like I had gone to Wellesley College and I was signed up for calc and physics. And my parents, my parents made me do calc and physics and I bombed it, And then going into finance was the backup. So I proved them wrong. I got myself into investment banking. And they were still shocked. To them, it wasn't really traditional. They didn't get it until later on. They realized it was something interesting, and they just thought, I could survive financially. I think every parent is always worried about that. But matchmaking came about actually as a lark. At Wellesley, I'd set up over 100 people for our annual blind date formal dance, and I expanded the reach to men and women from local universities like Harvard and MIT, Cornell, Amherst, and it was a lot of fun. And I always thought it was really interesting, but I never thought it was a career option. I had been working in banking. I found it, it's very draining and it's really not sustainable if you really want to have a family. So later on, I went into tech, which was also difficult. I ran a tech startup. I got seed funding from great blue chip investors. It was a lot of work. But I think in the end, I've always kind of gone back to, hey, I like matchmaking. Is there anything there I could make it into a career? And I ended up training with the industry's matchmaking godmother, who has 2 New York Times bestsellers. And I trained with 17 others from around the world. And I got my certifications. And I made this into a career. And ironically, it actually can be quite reasonably lucrative. It's not investment banking craziness, but it's quite survivable and quite nice. And the most important part, it's just amazing to be energized, working and connecting with so many interesting people. I learn something all the time from each and one of my clients.
That's great. So many things here I want to just pull on these different strands.
Sure.
So the first one that jumped out was going to Goldman Sachs being seen as a backup option to, I don't know, at least my grandmother wanted a doctor. She wanted a medical doctor in the family. I don't know, 6, 7 children, 24 grandchildren, now all in 60, 70, in her lineage. Not a doctor in the bunch, right? Not a single doctor out of like 3 or 4 generations. So what were your parents hoping for your career? And tell me about the emotional experience of trying that maybe in school and then shifting to banking, which maybe for a lot of people is the career, but I guess maybe in your family culture, it wasn't seen as sort of the top choice.
You are hitting the spot on. So my parents had very, very high expectations. They come from scientists. My dad has a PhD in high energy lasers, and he worked on the Neil Armstrong moon shot with a Cornucopy laser. So that's their world. My grandfather, I remember as a child, when I was a child, told me I should grow up and I should aspire to win a Nobel Prize. That was the pressure I was under.
Oh, jeez.
And then what I meant to say was I loved art and I loved music. And when I had gone to Wellesley, when freshman year, I actually had put that in my course choices. And my dad made me take them both off. And that's why the calculus and physics came in instead. But it's only when I did very, very poorly in it, despite all their support and help, that they started to realize maybe there's something else. And then going into banking just seemed like an option. I actually worked in consulting as a summer job. I worked at LEK. I worked at some other, and Price Waterhouse back then for summer jobs. And it was interesting. And it was either consulting or banking. And I went into banking. My parents were befuddled, and they'd never heard of Goldman, never heard of JP Morgan. It was new for them, and they loved me enough to go along the path with me, but I think they were a little bit surprised. And it wasn't what they were comfortable with at all, especially when I told them about the long hours and the craziness.
So you had this sort of career path, and then you made this detour. When you went to Goldman, were you super excited? Like, oh, I really want to try this. This is something I want to do. Or were you disappointed that you couldn't maybe make it as a scientist? Help me understand sort of that experience.
There was a lot of, it was hard. It was hard to not do well in the classes in physics and that my parents really wanted for me. It was hard because every time there was a setback at work, they would not necessarily know how to understand it and would say, maybe you should just leave it. And they didn't understand that this was something I really wanted to do and really wanted to make happen. I later on rose up through the ranks. I was at Bear Stearns first. I was an analyst, and I became an associate. Then at JP Morgan, I was an associate. And then I got poached by Goldman and went from associate to, back then in Hong Kong, they called it executive director. So I was starting to do quite well, but my parents still didn't quite understand it.
Got it. My mom still does not understand what I do for a living. my entire career, I've not been able to explain it. I've just given up. She's like, well, at least he's not living at home. He's paying his bills and must be okay, right?
That's true. They just won't understand exactly. And then to be a doctor, that's a noble profession, right? That's something that brings honor to the family. They can talk about it with all their friends and family. My son, the doctor.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting. So it reminds me of when I was in college. I really wanted to be an investment banker. From age, yeah. So age 13, I went to there was this TV show on TV at the time called Family Ties, and there's this character, I forget, Michael J. Fox played the character. I forget the character's name. And he was like this finance guy, and I really wanted to be like him. I went to summer camp on Wall Street as a 13-year-old. I was networking at Bear Stearns at age 13. Yeah. And so met folks at Lehman Brothers sort of in my later teens, and had my own investment portfolio at age 10, looking at my finance portfolio management theory, right, at age 11, indexing funds at age 14, sort of knew all that stuff. And
wow.
So I was really into it. And for the life of me, I could not get an interview with any investment bank.
Oh.
Not get a one, right? Goldman said no, Morgan said no, Lehman said no, Bear Stearns said no, everyone said no. And I was pretty bummed, right? That was sort of like the preferred, I thought. And now, so I sort of, as a backup, I tried this consulting thing, and it turned out over the years, much better fit for me. Fairly well known in that field, have helped thousands of people get into that field. But it came from at the time, which seemed like what I perceived to be a failure, right? I couldn't quite cut it as a banker. I guess I'll be a consultant. And in hindsight, I'm so glad. I'm so glad I got rejected by banking. because it really consulting was a better fit for me. But that wasn't obvious at the time. And it seems like what your story reminded me of a little bit of, oh, maybe those grades in physics, maybe that was a challenge, right? And not the preferred option. But these detours, right? And I think a lot of people listening are in the middle of these detours. And I know it seems like it worked out well for you, it worked out well for me. And that sometimes in the middle, it's a little hard to tell, right? If this is good or bad.
It is. And I think that it's so important to point this out, Victor, because I think through rejection, what we perceive as rejection and hurtful actually is opportunity. It really is opportunity because, investment banking is not the be all end all. Consulting is not the be all end all. And the reality is that most people, when they go into this, do it for a few years and the majority will leave. So I think it's always so important to know that there are other options out there and to not feel worried or scared. There's a Chinese phrase about a general who loses his horse, and it's actually viewed as being a positive versus a negative. And basically, he doesn't have to get caught. His son doesn't have to get caught into war. I mean, there's a lot of things about this in history and in life of where I think through what we perceive as a bump is actually an opportunity to open your eyes, do a reset, and understand that there's other great options that might be a better fit.
Yeah, now our conversation reminds me of the commencement speech that Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, gave at Stanford a couple of years back, and he was talking about how he was maybe in his college age years, if I recall correctly, he decided to take a class in calligraphy, right?
Yes.
Right, which was like really random, right? Given kind of his life experience up until that time, but he loved it, and he said that experience in calligraphy became the inspiration for the Mac user interface, what we now call a graphical user interface. Almost all computers have some kind of graphical user interface, and the idea of calligraphy fonts, right, which are very standard, and all kids today sort of grow up with being able to change font sizes and font faces. And he said, had I not taken that calligraphy class, it would have never occurred to me that you could marry very technical computing with this beautiful art form of typefaces, which became the Mac, which then became the iPhone, the iPad, and all computing is now based on this. And so in his speech was, in the middle of things, he said, at the end of your life, looking back, all the experiences connect up and they make sense at the end of your life. But in the middle, sometimes it's hard to tell, right? And so I love that message, and it sounds like similar to your life experience and similar to mine. So I want to make sure people heard that message because I think it's important.
I agree wholeheartedly. And that is such an interesting story. And I think, as a parent also, I think about this because passion is something that you don't have to push on, right? If somebody really cares about something, then you're not dragging dead weight. And sometimes it may not be what you expect it to be, but it's so important. I think every Asian parent, we're always encouraging our kids to study, but I found it so much easier when you let them pull the cart themselves. It's important.
I've noticed that as well. One other thing you mentioned earlier was about making the transition to Matchmaker. You talked about training under the godmother of that field. I was surprised when you sort of mentioned that in our earlier conversation and earlier today. Training, I thought this was more of like an intuitive art, right? You sort of have this natural talent, which I'm sure that you do. But tell me more, like, is this a professional discipline? Are there skills to be learned? and us in on, like, what does that training look like, and how elaborate is it?
Okay, that's a great question. So, everybody views themselves as being a backseat matchmaker. People gravitate towards relationships and love, and everybody wants to make that great match. But when you want to make it into a career and make it sustainable, there is a lot. I mean, I don't know if I can show you, but in the back, I have books on matchmaking. I'm reading every book on matchmaking that there is, or relationships. It's a lot of training. So I trained maybe 6 years ago. I had been doing it before, but I got formal training and certification. We trained, like I said, with 17 other matchmakers. But what it involved was, case studies and, the latest apps, knowing what we're competing against, just numerous examples and practice calls and just understanding different customer segments and niches. And also just kind of the more important thing also were best practices. I think that's really important. The thing with matchmaking is there's not a formal governing body, like if you're a lawyer or a doctor. So matchmaking is a little bit of a free-for-all, but I think it's really important though for the quality matchmakers, and there's certain alliances that I'm a part of, that we follow a certain code of conduct. And I think that's important for the industry as a whole. There are many uncertified matchmakers, but I think the ones that really have the training and have the longevity, I think they're definitely a cut above. And I support that. And I enjoy working with my fellow matchmakers as part of the alliance. And also I love the folks at Kelleher. I mean, it's a community, and it's a small world. Everybody knows each other.
I imagine. So it's fascinating because I do a lot of professional development. I encourage, my students and followers to do a lot of professional development. And it seems like there's the same philosophy, like at the elite level, of your field, of continuously learning and improving and learning from each other. So it's great to see that is part of the culture.
Absolutely, it's important for sustainability.
Perfect. So let's talk a little bit about some of the people listening and watching today. They're in this crossroads, feeling this tension between what they're supposed to do in life and their career versus what they want to, right? And you've gone through sort of that fork in the road decision-making process. I have as well. I'd love to talk a bit about that. So when you had to make that fork in the road decision, walk me through, what were the questions and concerns and worries that came up with you? And let's talk about that and how you got through that. And I would love to sort of share our 2 points of view, on that.
My parents and family were shell-shocked when I decided to leave much of the of a high paying jobs behind. I mean, think about it, from their perspective, they had finally accepted that I was not a scientist, and now they realized that investment banking, was a good way to make a living, and I could support a family with my husband, who's a software developer. But just to leave that behind, they didn't understand it, right? So I think, Asian culture, sometimes we are in a culture of scarcity. So we're always trying to save and go for high paying jobs. So it was hard for them to accept this. It wasn't easy, but I think that they always love me, and they try to understand, and they were supportive. And my husband was supportive too, and is still supportive, even though it's kind of an odd profession to some outsiders.
And so in that decision-making process, was it an easy decision for you to make because you were so clear on what you were passionate about, what you wanted to do? Or was it a difficult decision for you to make? I know the parental thing is one aspect, but just for yourself, was it a no-brainer, or you had to really struggle with that decision?
I had to struggle. I had struggled a lot because, there's a certain pride that one has, now as, oh, I was an investment banker, or I ran a tech company. So it is different because the reaction one gets when we define ourselves sometimes by not just our family, but also by our career, it is different when people ask me, what do I do for a living? And I say I'm a matchmaker. It's a different reaction that you get. And I have to also realize that that's not necessarily the affirmation that I need from others is based upon my career, right? It's also about something that I just shine at. My eyes shine when I talk about it. And I think I always have to kind of win people over when I talk to them, and when they see how much I love it. Like my friends all say, oh, Cassindy, your eyes just shine when you talk about your career. Yeah, I don't think my eyes shone when I was talking about being a banker.
I feel your passion and your energy you come across, and so it's great. And it's interesting. So when I made my own transitions, when I left consulting at McKinsey to be a startup CEO, it was at a time when that was not the thing that's in vogue, right? It's pretty popular, very socially acceptable, even revered, right, in many cases. And so I had a McKinsey partner like literally throw a pencil at me when I told him I was quitting.
Because you're at the name brand consulting firm McKinsey. It's like, how could you leave, right?
Yeah, and I was they had just done performance reviews. I was top 10% in the world, right, for my tenure, and it was a lot of are you crazy? Right.
Yeah.
I remember my father, like he really wanted to work for a Fortune 500 company. Being an immigrant, with the whole sort of bamboo, sort of the Asian glass ceiling, had a very hard time in the 60s and 70s doing that. So he ended up starting his own company. And so he was so excited that, his oldest son had finally gotten where he could not. And then I promptly quit. So that was a long conversation too, trying to explain that. And I don't think he ever totally got it, but he went along with it. And
Loves you.
yeah, yes, absolutely. And so I think there is this aspect of making the decision for yourself. I like that you brought up the not getting that validation from others. I certainly experienced that. A lot of my McKinsey contacts at the time stopped being in contact. Right? Oh, he's not going. He's doing that crazy thing, and only one person from that era am I in touch with. But it's the one great friend I have from that, and so I think that's an important factor, and I want to hear about that. So talk more about that validation or the lack of, and was that difficult for you? Did you sort of just able to sort of accept it for what it was? I would love to see how you handle that.
It's so true. It was hurtful. It was hurtful too, because people will sometimes measure you, right? Especially in competitive industries such as consulting and investment banking, they do measure you. There's a measure, like how much money do you make, what position you're at, what bank are you at. And so, yes, it was difficult. And, it's telling that the person that stayed in touch with you is your friend. And I think it really was important to understand who's your friend too. In Chinese, we have a phrase called 酒肉朋友, which means wine and meat friend. And that basically means somebody who's there with you for the wine and the meat, but not there for you as a friend. And I think in life, there's so many challenges. It's really important just to know who your friends are, because, it's a small world and those connections matter. And frankly, I don't necessarily have that much time for everybody, right? So to have time for friends makes a big difference. And I think also just getting that strength to know that it doesn't matter what others think. And if you're good at what you do, people will look and people will see, and it comes back in its own way.
Well, that's so beautifully said. I've made a lot of friends. I've lost a lot of friends, and I lose them on the way down. Quote unquote friends, right? Which were not deep friendships to begin with. And the ones I really valued are the ones that were there with me on the way down or at the bottom. In sort of at least sort of the traditional description of that. And so I really value those. And so I'm super excited to talk further about relationships. And just to wrap up this topic, any thoughts, like for someone who's maybe in their 20s or early 30s, they have the equivalent of a matchmaking for you, or for me, it was sort of working for myself when it was not in vogue and not popular. What do you say to someone who is sort of contemplating that choice? Right, you've talked about not getting too attached to that external validation. Any words of wisdom for them?
I think it's always important to keep your options open, especially in today's world. There's a Chinese phrase called "ride the mule to catch the horse." 骑驴找马. And what that embodies is, you just have to kind of, put feelers out or just tend to it. Because later on, then if you really want to catch that horse, you can catch it. So for example, if you're an investment banker, but you might enjoy matchmaking, I'll just use myself as an example, then you might just kind of keep in the back of your back of your head, just reading certain books, keeping kind of up to date on what's going on. That's important, because later on you can turn that switch on. So I think that it's important to keep your options open and plant seeds. Always important to plant seeds. And that way, when you're ready, you can take advantage of it.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is it doesn't have to be like an all or none, right? You can start dabbling right in that area, test the waters, get some feedback, make some progress, maybe in the evenings or weekends, that kind of thing.
Exactly. I mean, I remember I was I'm laughing. I was working as a tech CEO or CFO at that time. And on the side, I was dabbling in, reviewing certain investments in real estate and, just different things. I think it's always important to just keep your options open.
So along those lines, one thing I realized that I did, I'm curious if that's something you did, was when I pursued the road less traveled, I made sure to not burn any bridges on where I came from. So I left McKinsey on very good terms, so that if I needed to, I could go back. And so I was wondering, like, when you left banking, like, did you still have good ties? Could you have gone back to banking if maybe whatever you did next didn't quite work out?
Probably. I mean, it's been a while now, but at the time, absolutely. I probably could have, I could have found a way to go back to banking. Um, yeah, I think it's so important to just always keep your bridges open. And I think that's one thing I've done is I've always kept in touch with people that I knew at Goldman and Morgan. I still have them as my friends. And it's important to have that bridge open.
Got it. So I think what I'm thinking metaphors a lot. So instead of like light switch on and off, I'm thinking dimmer switch, right? You have some fluidity to pursue the new thing. You can go back if you really get into trouble. And maybe it's a risk managed way to pursue your passions rather than all or none.
Exactly. And another way to look at it too is think of it like you're tending plants. I feel like we have different flowers and different plants, and you just put a little water here, put a little water there, just to kind of keep it percolating. And also, just again, talking to people opens your eyes. You see, you hear what's going on. You hear what are the good firms to work for, who are the good bosses they have. It's just it's kind of networking 101, but it's still important just to go back and kind of ruffle through your old connections and just contact them.
Yeah, great. So I talk a lot about building, establishing, and nurturing relationships. That's how we met. We were at a tech conference a couple of years back at the same one. We never met at the conference. I think I reached out to you afterwards, and you reached back, and we just had honestly a brief 10, 15-minute call was what I was intending, just to say hello. And turns out we had so much in common. You're like the most fascinating person I've met in the last couple of years. And
likewise, I found it fascinating to talk to you and to hear your story. It's very, very compelling. I really enjoyed hearing this.
Thank you. And we've had so much in common, being Asian Americans, sort of navigating in our own ways these different cultures, our families, these professional circles. So I saw a lot of parallels. And so, on topic of relationships, you clearly are in the professional relationships, and you've had a lot on your own individually. I have as well. Let's sort of transition and talk about relationships. And, as a professional matchmaker, it's about finding the right people, connecting, dating, and ultimately having a long-term relationship. For those who are sort of in that dating phase, what are some strategies and tips and maybe some counterintuitive ideas for how people should approach dating? You hear a lot about it. I've done it. I'm not super thrilled with the whole process, and, very app driven. I feel like romance is now down to a database record, which, I have some strong feelings about. But from your point of view, like, how should the rest of us be approaching dating? Any suggestions and tips?
Absolutely. I think I laugh because nobody enjoys online dating. That's the majority of dating these days. Nobody says, "Oh, I can't wait to go online." So I think the gist of my tips for today really center around attitude and approach. I think that makes such a difference, when people meet. The whole goal of whether it's online dating or matchmaking is just to meet that person. And so I think first is be deliberate. And one thing that I would say some people get friend zoned is be deliberate. And I think that what I mean by that is have the confidence that if that person is on a coffee date with you or lunch date with you, that they are curious about you. Don't go in trying to impress them and try to, be confident. Just don't get friend zoned from the get-go. Make a compliment. They're there because they want to meet you. So therefore you can come back and let them know right off the bat. Make a statement that is not a friend zone. Like, "Oh, you look really great today." That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And I think that's so important is that first attitude. The second point I would say is be curious about your dates. Ask a question. Sometimes people get so nervous and they're so keen to present themselves, they don't necessarily understand what their date's perspective is, and they don't necessarily ask enough questions. And so what I do as a trick with some of my clients is I will tell them before they go on a date, "I'm going to ask you afterwards how your date went, and I have a questionnaire that you fill out, a survey." And so they know in the back of their heads that I'm going to be asking them to tell me 3 things about their date. And that changes the mindset. So they know that when they go in, they're going to have to ask their date some questions, and that stops them from just talking about themselves. Me, 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 me. I'm this, I'm that. And so I think that mindset change is really important.
Yeah, let me just pause for a second on that, because you have two great gems there. First, the phrase friend zone, right? Not everyone's going to understand that. It's a very international,
Oh, okay.
at least 60, probably 100 different countries in terms of this interview. So how would you define friend zone for those who may not be familiar with that particular expression?
Okay, friend zone means that you take what is what is supposed to be a romantic meeting, a meeting to ascertain chemistry, into just a business meeting or a friend meeting. And so I think what happens is people are afraid of rejection, right? And so if we're on a date, Victor, and 25 years ago when we were all young, and I said, "Oh, let's go work on this case study together." That's just, then there's no rejection, right? Oh, we're all working on this. Whereas instead, if you and I said to each other, like, "Wow, you look really nice today. I love how you look in that jacket," or something like that. Or, "Oh, would you like to have dinner?" Things like that are much more deliberate. And I think that's what I mean by not getting friend zoned, because we're afraid of rejection. So sometimes our backup stance is to go into the friend zone. And I think it's important not to do that. Just know that the person is actually there because they want to meet you. They're curious about you. Come with that mindset first.
Got it. And so when I hear the term friend zone, it's being a guy, I hear it from a very male-centric point of view from others, and it's the woman, for heterosexual cisgender dating, it's the woman put me in the friend zone, right? It's like this action that happened to you, and I think using some terminology I've heard, what I'm hearing from you is that it sounds like sometimes people put themselves in the friend zone by acting more like a platonic friend on what was supposed to be a date than having and conveying romantic interest. And my guess, what I'm hearing is, if you want to be on a date, act like you're on a date, as opposed to just catching up with a friend for coffee, right?
Exactly. Absolutely. You nailed it.
Great. I'm so fascinated by the questionnaire you give your clients. So you're assessing them on not just how well the date went from their point of view, you're assessing them on how well did they get to know their date. And so tell me more about that, because I hear, I have a lot of women friends, and a lot of them complain about like the guy that just talks endlessly about himself and he's quite impressive, but didn't ask me a single question over an hour and a half, right? So how common is this issue in your clientele? And is this a skill that can be trained to be sort of more inquisitive, right? More curious about their date? I'm curious about that.
It's very common. And it's, especially for mid-level professionals and above, right? It's very common. And it's not just women or men, it's both. Both sides are so programmed to just talk about themselves, and they lead with their career quite often, because that's how our society sometimes defines us and our self-worth, by our careers, where it really should be about, can I get along with this person? Do I want to live with this person? Doesn't matter whether they're CEO of a firm, whether they're the top antitrust lawyer at their partnership. Doesn't matter. At the end of the day, it's can two people get along and coexist? So I think that perspective is really important to really bring people back down to kind of who they are underneath. And that's important to change that mindset, to understand everybody wants to be understood. Everybody wants to be heard. So it's important to make it both ways.
It's where I had this sort of moment. This is maybe just me, but hearing an Asian American woman talk about being heard and understood.
That's a big topic.
That is a big topic, as an amazing topic, and I think it reminded me, because when we first met, we had talked about a lot of this stuff, about essentially topics related to emotional depth, right, and connection and emotional intimacy. I don't think we use those words, but that was sort of what came up in my head, and so I just had a moment of how amazing is this, of having these sort of two things I see as very separate, right? Asian culture in particular, and sort of this deep intimacy. They don't usually go together in the same sentence. And so it's amazing that we're having this conversation, and specifically with you. With your clients getting to know their dates, give me some examples of questions. Like if they don't know how to do it, like what are the questions they should be asking, right? You learn by sort of doing things mechanically if you're not used to it, until it gets natural and sort of built some automatic, sort of default proficiency. But can you give me some examples of questions that you would recommend people ask their dates?
That's a good one. Sometimes it sounds silly, but just be very granular. Like, how was your weekend? What did you do? When was the last time you spoke to, or tell me about your college roommate? Stories that, I would start off first with something that's somewhat neutral, that's not too, won't make people feel too exposed. And over time, then you can open up in other areas, right? The key is just to get the tempo of communication. And people love talking about maybe their pets, their children, a great meal that they had. And those are just ways just to get started. And sometimes you can start going into certain relationships. You don't want to start off with, oh, how was your ex?
That's a landmine.
I just wanted to say, I do really love your perspective on Asian Americans. And when we talked last, I thought that was so important, and it resonated with me so much because it is a shared experience and it is a unique experience. But yet there's certain ties there that are irrelevant for many people. It doesn't matter just Asians. But I think, for Asians, we're fighting against stereotypes. And how to, it's not just friend zone. I think, for example, whether Asian men or Asian women, there are certain stereotypes that we have to fight against or how to undo. And not with anger or resentment, but also just to rise above it and make it into a positive. And here's an interesting thing, I think, with Asian men, is that there have been a lot of negative stereotypes. And I've been writing a blog about how it's time for an Asian male renaissance, because I think Asian men actually make some of the best dates because they're family oriented, they're financially sound. Everybody's asking for that. And there they are. But I think sometimes for Asian men, they may forget that, hey, you're actually quite solid in the dating world, but it also means putting yourself out there. And I think sometimes people don't know that the world has started to shift, and that's important, for example. I'm digressing.
No, right. So a couple of things I want to tease out here. So we talked a little bit about stereotypes, right? And so one thing I noticed, when I've done online dating, I have felt the stereotypes because I track my metrics, right? I'm analytically driven. And then of course. I got spreadsheets. I have a lot of spreadsheets. And that my experience in sort of connecting in that dating way in person is quite different than online, right? Because I think the stereotypes are more prominent. You see a picture, you assume a lot. And then in person, it's much more experiential. And I do better in person, right, than online. And one of the things that you had talked about, I want to sort of tie these strands together, is about asking your date questions and having them be granular. And one of the things I like to teach about building these conversational skills, because a lot of folks I work with, that's not what they're known for, right? They're known for being in the background, not being extroverted, they're being more introverted, doing good work, in terms of their careers. But as you progress, it's much more relational, right? You're managing people, you're interacting with people, you're representing your firm, you're becoming a spokesperson, a leader, or a thought leader. So one of the conversational tips I want to sort of put an exclamation point on, because you had talked about it, was I like this idea of asking people questions based upon something you just learned about them within the last 5 minutes. And what I find is sometimes I had this one person I never forget who wanted to ask me questions, and it was like he was reading off of a script. And no matter what answer I gave, he didn't acknowledge the answer, didn't comprehend the answer, didn't ask any follow-up questions about the answer, and just went to the next question. It's like, I got to get through 10 questions with this person. I'm going to just boom, boom, boom. And it just felt odd, right, to me.
Yeah, well, they're clearly nervous, it sounds like.
Probably, or inexperienced, perhaps, something like that. And so I like what I find brings a conversation alive, and I like to break things down in sort of a mechanical engineering kind of way for easier comprehension, is ask questions about something that you just discovered in the last 5 minutes of the conversation. So, we had an outline for our talk today.
I know.
We had a skeleton, right? So if we got lost, we could always come back to what we had planned.
Sure, it's all good.
It's all good. And we've intentionally so, I've asked you lots of questions that I did not plan to ask because you said something that prompted something and I thought was really interesting, right? And I wanted to learn more. And so I just wanted to explain that and you have as well from me. So we're role modeling in some ways what a dynamic conversation looks like, yep. Of which neither one of us really knows how this conversation is going to end because we're both being very present, right?
Exactly. And I think it's also because, Victor, I think I love how you're thinking and approaching and how you tease out certain threads and you dig in more. So, it's fun for me to hear somebody, and to kind of see how you're thinking.
Yeah, I'm weird that way.
Well, there's a reason why you're so good at what you do.
Right?
I read your bio, top ranked, McKinsey analyst and well educated. Yeah, no, it's always very, very, I always learn. Like I said, I learn from every person that I talk to, and I'm learning a lot from you.
Likewise. All right. So back to dating advice, right? So if you don't want to be a friend and be put and sort of be labeled as a friend, don't act like a friend. Act like a potential romantic love interest.
Exactly.
Talk about that. You talked about getting to know your date and asking them questions. Anything else you would suggest for dating best practices based on all of your experience?
I think there's something to be said about civility and punctuality. And, there's so many other tips that one could offer, but I think one thing that's really important that I think we forget in today's world is common courtesy. And it goes such a long way. Being there in time. If you're being late, just notify your date, a proper greeting. It sounds old fashioned, but because it doesn't happen enough, it will make the person stand out.
So tell me more about that, because for me, in my mind, that's sort of like should be, I hope, and I hope my kids do this. I don't know for sure. Like should be automatic. I would hope, right? Being polite on time. And is that not the norm? Like tell me.
It is not the norm these days.
Really?
And it's funny because you could have some very, very high-end clients on dates and they may not behave particularly well. And it sends a bad message but inadvertently, I just had two very high-end clients on a date and one was late, and it just put a damper on things. And it happens more often than you think. Like to me and to yourself, I think we probably have, polite parents and we knew that we had to greet our elders and be polite and not be late. But I think in today's world, it happens so much. So I actually have to remind everybody always be punctual, be on time, give a greeting. And also even when the date ends, be courteous and say, thank you. I had a great time. It sounds silly to have to make this a reminder, but because it happens more often than you would think, I do put it out there.
Got it. And even at the elite client level, right? So these are very, very accomplished people, high net worth, high prestige professions. And so showing up on time is not always presumed to be the norm, like an automatic.
No, it's not always what it should be.
Wow. And is it like I was intended to be on time and then major traffic jam, car accident, I couldn't be on time? Or there was not even an intention to be on time? I'm curious.
I think it's approach sometimes. I think there's a certain amount of arrogance that sometimes people will have, and they may not understand that, because if you think about on a date, they don't know the other person very well. Right. So therefore they may not take it as seriously as, let's just say, if they were being late for another CEO or something like that. So they may think of themselves as being more important. That goes back to the thread about, when you talk about relationships, it's just two people. It's not about the resume or my position above one or the other. And so it's always so important to realize that at the end of the day, it's two people. It's not a CEO and a hanger-on or something like that. So it's just, it's about attitude.
Got it. So really treating people as sort of emotionally, in a way, sort of equals in terms of importance.
Exactly.
There isn't that hierarchy, even if you're quite successful in your career. That doesn't matter in these.
Exactly. Because if you think about it, what's one of my tips was what you put out influences what you get back. I think that's really important, because if you're being high-handed or arrogant and being just an unpleasant person, the people that will still be attracted to you will only be attracted to you not because of your personality, but because maybe something that you can provide them. So it becomes much more transactional, right? Okay. So I think it's really important to understand that how one behaves influences so much of the kind of people that you'll be attracted to.
Got it. So I want to drill down this one because I think it's an important point. So walk me through an example. So if you do a certain behavior that perhaps isn't ideal, how does that change who gets attracted and who doesn't?
So for example, the one example I gave before was very kind of conventional, right? You have the wealthy individual and a so-called gold digger, right? That's a very kind of common trope. Okay. Another one could be if you're insecure or unsure, then you can inadvertently attract somebody who's quite controlling, right? And so that happens more often than we think. So therefore, I think that's also when we go into the influence and what you get back, it's also important for the person who's going out on a date to be their best self, right? Because if they're happy and they're bold and they're in their best self, then they will hopefully also attract back the person who appreciates that best self. I'm not saying that everybody has to be bouncy and happy and this, but they should be in a position of being their personal best.
Got it. And along those lines, I know you've mentioned in the past about sort of being introspective or looking inward around your past relationship histories, your family histories, that influences whether you show up as the best version of yourself or the worst version of yourself. Any thoughts around that in terms of knowing that history, in terms of how you show up and how do you get to the best version of yourself? What does that process look like?
I think it's about personal responsibility. It's so important because, you've always heard about relationships where somebody's always complaining about maybe their ex or their ex-boyfriend or their ex-spouse. But that's not a position of responsibility, because you also have to understand that you were complicit in the dysfunctionality of a relationship. Mm-hmm. So I think it's upon us as people to look into ourselves, and to really hear feedback, versus just the rah-rah, you go girl, or everything was fine, that person's is terrible. But also understand your own responsibility for a breakdown in a relationship or behavior that is unpleasant. It's just important to really know that and understand that and take responsibility. And I think sometimes what we have is it's hard for us to grow up, right? Mm-hmm. And it's painful to grow up. But part of that is, I'll give an example of my own self, is growing up and taking responsibility and drawing boundaries, right? That was hard for me to do. And then I would be resentful when people impinged upon my boundaries, realizing that I never drew them in the first place. And so as I've matured as a person, taking responsibility and drawing boundaries. And I think, for example, in Asian American culture, there's a lot with our parents, right? We're very respectful. We follow certain, we let our boundaries get pushed because we are supposed to be dutiful. But sometimes it's important to be able to push back, because otherwise we get resentful. And if we're resentful, then we're going to carry that out into the rest of our lives. And the key is just to stop that and be able to say, hey, I'm not okay with this, but I'll do this, and I won't be okay with that. And then you aren't as frazzled. And then you are happier in other aspects of your life.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is the things that people would complain about in a relationship, usually they kind of often blame the other person for it, right? So in your case with your family, it's why are they doing this to me? And in your own self-assessment, you realize, oh, I have not set limits. I'm contributing to the thing I don't like. And you were wise enough to realize it. You made your change. It makes life easier for yourself.
Absolutely. A common one is, my husband never picks up after himself. Everything's all messy, and then the flip side could be, well, I pride myself in saying, oh, I always work so hard. I always do everything, because and then it makes the person feel like superior. I'm doing everything. The house would not run without me. But then sometimes maybe the flip side is, are you letting the other person get a chance to do that and to take ownership of that as well? So it's always two sides.
Always two sides. Oh, interesting. Okay. So, it's sort of transition into sort of, best practice. It's a terrible word for romantic context, but let's use it. Best practice for romantic relationships. It sounds like understanding yourself is a big part of it. What are some other tips around how do you have a good marriage, a good romantic partner, beyond just knowing yourself?
Romantic marriages, it's a lot of work. It always is work. And I think that sometimes we have this fairy tale ideal that it's just got two people and they all go off in the sunset. And I think that it's really important to understand the stressors that we have in life, whether it's work, children, finances, health, these, parents, family, it takes a lot of mental energy. So I think the prioritization is really important. I think many successful CEOs or executives don't necessarily acknowledge this because they're engrossed by their work, right? And so things get neglected. So I think, again, going back to the analogy earlier of like a plant, we have to plant flower, put water and fertilizer. I think it's important to really prioritize the relationship and to have actual one-on-one time for that connection, because couples are evolving. People are evolving. If they don't evolve together, then they will split. So I think it's always important to have those touch points where you can just meet up one-on-one and not necessarily only talk about the children or finances, but also just about what made you happy today. What were you doing? Something funny. That's important. I think prioritizing relationships is quite often not done enough. Another suggestion that I think is important is also communication. And this is a really easy one. So easy. You can go online. It's what is your love language? And that's kind of basically talking about knowing your audience, right? Knowing your partner and what matters to them. So, the love language is physical touch, words of affirmation, a quality time, et cetera, are so important that if you don't know what your partner really resonates with them, you're basically talking to a wall. And in Chinese, we call it playing the flute for the cow, 对牛弹琴. Like the scholar was playing this beautiful song, but meanwhile, it wasn't resonating with the audience, in this case, a cow, and the cow just moves. But the point, all laughing aside, the point is you really need to know what resonates with your partner. And it's not going to be what you think, but it's really what your partner can hear. And so, for example, with my husband, words of affirmation are really important, and physical touch. To me, words of affirmation, I just brush it off, right? So you have to really understand how to communicate with your partner.
Just sort of stepping back for 1 second around prioritization of the relationship and time. One of the things I actually in the middle of writing an article, so I started it before our conversation. I'm going to it next, around priorities, right? Sort of both at the corporate level, at the career level, and the personal level. And one of the things I say is that it's very easy to say a priority is blank, right? Our priority is to drive sales. Our priority is my kids and my family. Our priority is my spouse. It's much harder to change behavior. And one of the things I have my clients do is I do a calendar analysis, right? So yeah, so if let's say in the work setting, if the priority is, I had a client years ago, he said the priority is to drive more sales. It was like a two-person business. And so I get color code your calendar and color code all the activities like in blue, and then color code the thing that's important to you, in this case, driving sales, in red, okay? And show me your entire month, right? And in that analysis, he determined that I think he was driving $1 million in sales, doing 30 minutes of sales a month.
Wow.
Yes. Right? Sometimes you just got to ask the right questions. And yes. So, I wonder, so you're pulling 30 minutes of sales time a month, is the only person selling. You're pulling down $1 million in sales. My strong recommendation is to spend an hour a month.
Exactly.
Maybe 4 hours a month, maybe 4 hours a day.
I know.
Right. And so I sort of almost sort of intentionally, so I know him quite well, was to sort of like, almost shame him into it, of like the obviousness of the solution. Right.
Well, it's just
And
like one of us, right?
right, yeah, sometimes it is, but you got to do the numbers. I had another client who, in your demographic in terms of clientele, and it's like my priority is my family, right? Like that's like motherhood apple pie. Who would ever disagree with that?
Yeah.
And I said, no, well, show me your calendar, right? 24-hour day calendar. Where's the time with your family, right? With each child, right? And with your spouse, with all of them together, and it's like 1% of the time. Right? It's
Wow.
incongruent, right? And or in corporate strategy, if our effort is to grow our distribution in Asia or in Europe, what percentage of your staff is working on expanding into Europe? What percentage of your budget is allocated to expanding to Europe? Yeah, so it's allocation of resources. So the time here I'm seeing is, if you want to have a good relationship, it's got to be featured in your calendar, and you got to devote time, attention, and energy to it. Otherwise, the grass doesn't get watered, right?
Yeah, it's just words. I loved your analytical approach, of course, a consultant, right? Everything.
I can't help it. It's like breathing.
Yeah, no, I would be thinking, well, how do I measure that? Of course, you measure it by the calendar and the time spent. That's makes so much sense. Of course. Yeah, no, that's important.
And for those who don't know about the 5 love languages, it's a book, very popular in the United States.
Yes.
I don't know how well it is outside, but it's this idea that how people experience love varies by the individual, and there's sort of 5 types of love. You mentioned several of them, and the idea is, the premise of the book is, give love in the way that the person prefers to receive it, that feels loving to them, which might be different, and often it's different than what you would assume, because you are a different person than they are. So, I certainly can appreciate that.
Yeah, no, it's very useful. It's something that I learned a lot from. There's actually an online link for that too. I think you can do it. You can do a test yourself.
Okay, cool, perfect. So Google's a great resource for finding those. Sort of as we sort of wrap up, Cassindy, any final thoughts on non-traditional career paths, dating, having a great romantic relationship? When you step back from it all and everything you've experienced and learned from your own experiences and from your clients' experiences, any last final words that you want people to hear?
Wow, that's a really open-ended question, Victor.
It's by design. And if not, totally fine too, but I wanted to give you that opportunity in case you had anything that
I think it sounds silly and it sounds trite, but I think life is meant to be a little fun. I think quite often we agonize and we have too much anxiety. I think sometimes just go into it always with an approach that I'm going to learn something new. I'm going to have some fun. I think that if you go with that mindset, doesn't really matter what you're doing. It just makes it a lot more enjoyable and sustainable.
That's great. Sometimes the best things are fairly simple, not always easy to execute in real life, but
well, absolutely, Victor. I was, to be honest, I was like, oh, well, I'll be talking to, Victor today. And I think at first I was like, oh, well, this is a high-powered consultant. It's going to be really, difficult. But I realized, let's just have fun, because when we first spoke, I thought this is such an engaging person, and I've learned something. In fact, today I just now learned how to quantify time spent and to use it as a tool to achieve goals, for me, and I'll use that on my clients as well. So I learned something a lot today. So it's great.
Likewise, we're taking notes here in my head. I'm going to jot them down after we finish up. And so I want to thank you so much for making the time. I've enjoyed chatting with you multiple occasions now, and I'm sure we'll still be in touch going forward.
Absolutely.
For those who want to learn more about your background, your matchmaking practice, or getting in touch with you, what's the best way to reach you?
Sure. Thank you so much, Victor. I really appreciate it today. The way to reach me is my website is www.awmlove.com, which is Ancient Wisdom, Modern Love. And my email is just cassindy@awmlove.com, CASSINDY@awmlove.com. And I look forward to hearing from people.
Perfect. Thanks so much. A pleasure and such a treat for myself and for hopefully the hosts that were watching this as well. So thank you for making the time. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Victor. Likewise. I learned a lot from you today. Thanks.